So in addition to those craft lost in battle, like the 2 Midget submarines, what we also see is a wide array of other wrecks that sit out here in the waters off Pearl Harbor in a vast, purposely assembled collection, if you will, not deliberately selected as a museum curator would do, and nonetheless not particularly maintained as a museum, but just the same a reminder that what sits down here at the bottom of the oceans oftentimes is, in its own way, perhaps the world's greatest museum.
Okay, come in partial video.
Joining us from the University of Hawaii,
5.
we do have Dr.
Right.
Van Tilburg. I believe we also have Terry Kirby, Chris Kelly, and others from Hurl. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Jim.
Hey, Jim. Morning, Jim.
Anything you'd care to share? Perfect. While we're out here, Terry, maybe you guys would like to talk a little bit about your dives and some of the discoveries you've made out here.
Well, the area we're going to now with the 3-piece Midget was after 1991, when we decided to start dedicating some of our test dives to try and locate the Ward's Midget. The very first year we did that was in 1992, and on that dive was when we came across the stern section of what is now known as the 3-piece Midget submarine. We recognized it right away as a stern section of a Midget submarine. It had been disconnected at the flange joint. We could see that there was a cable that was rigged around the stern. So at that time, we just assumed that it was some war prize that was brought back and disassembled and then discarded. We didn't realize at the time on the first day that we spent dedicating test dives to try and find the Ward's Midget that we actually had located a piece of the 5th and final Midget from the Pearl Harbor attack.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to come back down. Can I take my rotator and move it down?
Pilots, if you don't mind jumping on OKX for a second and explaining to our audience what you're doing right now and some of the techs.
Here, Roland, they're talking about the white balance, so why don't you go ahead? I'm coming down, Joe.
So what we've just done was
I tilted you down.
Do the white balance.
No, I'm moving.
We use a calibrated chart
down to the seafloor
in order to ensure the cameras are precisely calibrated to the lights that we bring down here. And this will give you an accurate representation should you see these objects from the surface. By doing this calibration, where we ensure that what you see down here is as accurate as we can possibly get on the surface.
That is an Amtrak. No, that's an Amtrak. That's a vehicle. So, Terry Kirby, we are at one of the Amtraks. We must be getting close.
Yeah, this is. There are several of these around, and as you see, it's in a crater, and that's from the current continuing to scour away from these. There were some that were so deep that we couldn't pick them up as a sonar contact. We came to the edge of a crater, and there's a whole landing craft in the bottom of it.
I think we need to.
So these don't get buried; they just get scoured with a current.
So from
And I believe that this might be one of the ones we found that had a hole in the bottom of it. But there are several of these around the bottom and in the general area of the Midget sub.
Any guidance for the ROV pilots as we start to maneuver around this to head towards the pieces of the 3-piece sub?
Guess we'll pick back up and scan past it.
We should be close to the main hull section, the midsection of the 3-piece mini sub.
Turn my head to follow you.
But we're going to see a lot of targets like this, so the best thing is to remember where some of these targets are so we don't continue surveying the same target.
Roger that. Hans, do you mind telling everybody out there what we just looked at?
I'm going to keep turning.
Sure. These were small amphibious assault vehicles that were critical to the campaign in the Pacific. Putting troops ashore in hostile territory is one of the most dangerous things that navies have had to do and continue to train for.
Debris up ahead.
And in this area, we suspect that small LVTs like this, probably an LVT2, with that type of damage, likely came from Westlock in 1944.
Trail.
On May 21st, 1944, as we're preparing for the invasion of Saipan, Operation Forager,
That looks like
the LSTs that were nested near the Naval Magazine in Pearl Harbor were transshipping ammunition. Something went wrong. There was an explosion on the LST. Several other LSTs were damaged. These large amphibious ships had inside them these amphibious tracked vehicles that would deploy from the bow doors and then make the rush towards the shore. So there were numerous LVTs damaged, LCTs damaged, several of the LSTs lost in the Westlock explosions in 1944 are also out here in the depths of the ocean off of the harbor. Some of them have been discovered. Some remain to be found. And since it was wartime, the accident and the tragedy, there were many lives lost, particularly of the Army troops who were shipping that ammunition.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do
was hushed up. It was a secret at the time, and so it's sometimes not a story that's as well known, certainly, as the Pearl Harbor attack, but some have called it Pearl Harbor's second great tragedy, the Westlock explosion in 1944.
So I'm on 281, lined up with him.
Excellent. Thank you, Hans.
Yeah.
Terry, is this a shell? I seem to recall when we were diving with you with Hans that after we left that that vehicle, we passed right over or by a shell.
There are several of these, either coastal battery or battleship shells laying on the bottom out in this area.
Chris Kelly, are you there with us?
I'm right here.
Chris, maybe you might want to talk a little bit about what lives out here. And I think that for many of you watching, if you haven't been to the bottom of the deep ocean before, and most of us haven't, you might look at this as some form of a desert. But Chris, as I recall, there's a lot of life in here, isn't there?
Yeah, so we published a paper a number of years ago about the communities associated with disposed ordnance out in this area. And basically you have a group of animals that are adapted for living in the sediment. These are sea pens and certain types of fish and crabs. And then you have another whole group of animals that like hard substrate. So all of these munitions and all of this discarded
do you want to zoom in on this?
Pieces of equipment and the midgets of themselves are attractive to that group of animals. And these would include sponges and corals and certain types of sea stars and other types of crabs. So there's quite a lot of going on here. And the interesting thing is this area would not have hardly any hard substrate whatsoever if it wasn't for all of the material that has been dumped here. So there's been quite an interesting alteration in the community out south of Pearl Harbor.
Pulling out.
Thank you.
So that's a projectile of some kind, Hans. I don't know if
hammerhead
pretty
shark.
good size.
Serious.
Yeah, that's
Oh yeah. In the serious view, we've got a hammerhead shark.
Cool.
And back is like rifling. Yeah.
I guess.
Oh yeah, there's a name for that. Yeah.
I was scared for a second. I thought it was
Oh, yeah. Serious.
All right.
not even out there.
Hammerhead.
Yeah.
Can we push past the skids?
Commenting, there's a hammerhead shark in the Sirius view that just passed by right now.
Close the drawer. That'll give you a little more room. Drawer retracting.
That's cool. Never seen one.
And we've got some more debris, artifact of some sort lying right here as well.
Our shark whisperer.
Again, just a reminder that the easiest way to get rid of material in the past was to deposit it in the oceans.
Okay, moving toward that target. You want to swing your head
How
back?
far are we in that ship move?
So we want to tack on.
So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are on board the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, some 5 nautical miles off the entrance to Pearl Harbor, the island of Oahu in Hawaii. And what we are doing is diving on a target that is one of 2 Japanese Type A Kohaoteki Midget submarines, known as mini submarines to some, associated with the attack 75 years ago today on Pearl Harbor. The way this system works and what you're seeing is 2 remotely operated vehicles which are deployed from our ship. These vehicles, one hovering above, the other maneuvering closer to the bottom, and the different camera views enable us to have a downward look as well as, there she is. Okay, just spotted her. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, get a little excited. Even we supposedly ice water in our veins, archaeologists, scientists get a little worked up when we see the target we're looking for. In that scour hole team, you're going to see the central portion of the sub. So the 2 systems, the 2 submersibles, these robots, if you will, operate together in tandem. One looks down, the other looks forward. They carry a variety of sensors. Streamed through their cable, back through a satellite, you're able to watch this live as it happens. So you get those moments of excitement when somebody like me blurts out, there it is. So in the gloom ahead, we are approaching the central section of the Midget submarine, and we'll talk more about it as we get there. But perhaps, Terry Kirby, again, you discovered this with the rest of the team in the year 2000, as I recall. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was 2000 when we came across this initially. When I came across, out of the dark came this hull of A-class Midget submarine. We recognized it with a conning tower and periscope. And at that time, it was obvious that the stern had been blown out by internal explosion. At that time, we thought that maybe we had discovered the Ward's Midget sub, and that was where the shell had detonated. But when I moved up along the starboard side, saw there wasn't a hole in the conning tower, and our silk cloud cleared away, we could see that it had been disconnected at the flange joint.
Right.
And that there was a cable that was rigged through the, there was a hole punched in the top just on the forward hinge at the flange joint. And that cable was sort of draped down along the bottom. So we realized at the time that this was a midsection that went to the stern section that we found in 1992, which was similarly rigged. So what we're looking at right now, we're coming across the after section. When we first found this, it was really obvious that metal head was torn and splayed out. That metal has since corroded away around one of the main frames, so it's much cleaner. It was very obvious when we first found it that. So this is where the scuttling charge that was just aft of the control room detonated and partially blew this sub apart. So the report that a submarine was discovered that was partially in 2 really fits this sub right here. When we first found it, the periscope and everything was intact. We went back to the sub a few years later, and it seemed like it was in the advanced stages of decomposition. But you can see some of the batteries and some of the lead leads from the batteries that are, that's what we're looking at right now in this aft section. So this is sitting just down inside of, there's a little berm here. But Jim, this is what we tried to set before to try and look into the control room. So we're approaching it from a good position. Looks like our bucket dropped over.
Okay, your mic is not open, but I heard you want to put the photos up momentarily or right now?
Roger that. We're going to throw up some historic photos.
Okay, I'm going to do it on stream 3 full screen. Okay.
Hans, do you see the bucket?
Stream 3 is full screen.
Yeah, roger that. We're kind of scratching our heads on how it got tipped over with all that sand in there that we put in there.
Be aware you're in autoplay of your.
Roger that.
Well, I've actually watched one of those cook sharks come in and flip an excrement over once, so.
It could have been a big shark like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, what we're showing on the screen right now, for those of you who
Stream 3.
Can watch on screen 3, this is a historic photograph taken by the United States Navy of the central portion of one of these subs. This is the submarine that washed ashore on December 8th and was captured, commanded by Kazuo Sakamaki. What you see in this photograph is labeled and indicated is that portion of the sub to which both the bow and stern would be bolted. The sailor standing on the top is facing forward, and so the area that we are looking at is aft, that is back part of it.
Yep.
And much of what you see in the historic photograph has been destroyed in an explosion, which has opened up this hull and resulted in some of this damage. We're looking inside what was known as the after battery compartment, which is where a separate explosive charge would be placed and was in position for all of these submarines in the event that there was no other way to get out or to escape. What then would happen is that that charge would be set off. It was not necessarily designed as a toku or suicide weapon. What it was designed to be was a separate charge so that if you were in position where you could not get out, you could set this off underneath an enemy ship and try to sink it.
Gaining up.
The destructive damage we see here tells us that the crew in this submarine did, at the end of their mission, set that charge off. As to whether they were inside or not, we do not know. If they were, they would either have been in this place or farther aft where you see the sand piled up, which is the center command section of the sub. The bars that you see are from the batteries that were inside the submarine. This was the sole means of propulsion and power. And I'm also showing now another on screen 3 what those batteries look like, the batteries that were removed from Kazuo Sakamaki's submarine. You can see the bottom of the hull. You can see very clearly moving and looking back. You can see sand mounted up just past a bulkhead with a doorway or a hatch cut into it, which led into the central or command area of this sub.
Going to push into the sand on the top. A little tilt up.
You are now inside this submarine, which we believe to be the submarine associated with the larger sub I-16. The sand that you're looking at fills the area where the crew would have worked and been located. At this point, as that is very likely that what we are looking at, and actually we do consider this to be a war grave, I think it's entirely appropriate for a moment that we pause, and as we did previously with the other sub dive, we note that this is most likely the resting place of Masaji Yokeyama and Sadamo Oyeda, the crew members who launched in I-16 To, or the boat that belonged to the larger submarine I-16. And with that, as well, with apologies for my bad Japanese, may we also say, Yasuraka ni onemori kudasai. May they rest in peace. 75 years later, our former foes are now our friends, and they are our allies. And together, these young men, perhaps buried in that sand, sleep for eternity, just as the boys sleep inside the steel coffin that is the Arizona and in the Punch Bowl Cemetery and in other graveyards around America.
Full wide.
Down to the bottom left, what you see is one of those batteries which has been blasted open. You can see its lead plates in position and other batteries which have tumbled out. You also see some of the electric cable that tied all these batteries together.
Multi-views back on stream 3.
Do you think those straps back inside are bus bars?
Yes, those are bus bars, I would say. So very good, exceptional imagery here. You can see the conning tower, and for those of you who joined us for the earlier dive on the USS Ward, you now get a closer view of what was sealed inside the USS Ward midget submarine.
If you look at your quad split, I've now put your photos in the bottom right corner of the quad split.
Roger that. Thank you.
Yes, you're full wide.
So pilots, this is good. We're just going to continue around this side. We're going to want to look at the conning tower as well, but I think we can make a circuit of this first and go to the other end. And if you can, work up the other side, and then we'll look at the conning tower from there, please.
Quad split now includes the front camera.
Again, for those of you joining us, we are broadcasting live from the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, tied into our Exploration Command Center at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and to a variety of other scientists, friends, and all of you around the world, thanks to the magic of telepresence, which by means of these remotely operated vehicles streaming back to our ship and through satellite and then through the internet, you're able to participate in these dives. On your screen, in screen 3, for those of you who can, there is a historic photograph of one of these submarines. And as you can see, that one intact gives you a good sense of the level of damage to this craft, which was scuttled by its crew in the aftermath of the attack using an explosive charge placed inside what was known as the after battery compartment. You can see the damage to the hull, which was far more pronounced when this sub was first discovered in 2000, and you also see the remains of some of its batteries having tumbled out onto the seabed. This was entirely a battery-operated craft with an electric motor. These craft were the epitome of high technology in the day, were capable of navigating more than 20 knots, and had an extended range if run at slower speeds. If this is indeed I-16's boat, this craft remained in action for close to 24 hours. The final signal received by the mother sub, ostensibly from this midget sub, indicated that they were no longer able to navigate, and with that, most likely, the charge was set off, sending this sub to the bottom and most likely killing the 2 crew members, Masaji Yokoyama and Suemi Toyo.
Full wide. Push past skids. Copy.
Again, sorry. Killing the 2 crew members, Masaji Yokoyama and Sadamo Oyeda.
Now, is that the radio antenna?
The radio antenna, yeah, we'll see that there. Okay. So we are now moving it into an area that would be the forward battery compartment. Guys, I'd like to get closer to that hole and light it up. The hole that you see here is opened up in the side. Corrosion is ongoing, and it leads into the forward battery, which should still have its batteries inside. This compartment is more intact than the other, which of course had the scuttling charge go off in it. If you're looking at the historic photo, while it is reversed from the view we currently have, you can see the position of the conning tower and the placement of this compartment. There is an U.S. naval officer standing on top of it in the historic photograph, and that is one of these midget submarines, which washed ashore on December 8th on the other side of the island, was captured, disassembled, documented, and then toured the country selling war bonds to the end of the war.
Past the edge, you might see more.
Russ Matthews, are you with us?
Right now. Just hit the. It's not here.
Saw the light swing away when you made that last swing arm move.
It's not penetrating the light. Oh, no.
Sorry. Honolulu, do you have Russ?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you. So all of you out there, Russ Matthews is a colleague, participant in a number of these dives, and was here in 2014 with Terry Kirby and the team, making an amazing penetration with camera into this space and learning another secret of this sub and something that confirmed its identity. Russ, why don't you share that with everybody?
Sorry.
Oh, happy to. Yeah, we were able to insert a camera in actually that Colin Wallerman had engineered on the fly, to be able to get it inside this opening, and really, the first view initially we saw really just remains of batteries scattered throughout the compartment, and then tilted the camera up to try and look across the compartment and realized we weren't seeing the other side. We should have had a view of the internal structure of the rest of that hull, and realized there was something blocking our view, and then spotted just kind of the remains of a strap, and really what we've concluded is it was an extra air cylinder that had been inserted into the subs that were prepared specifically for the Pearl Harbor attack. So it was really more about what we couldn't see than what we could. But it was just one more piece of the puzzle, perhaps in revealing the ultimate identity of these subs.
Absolutely, and again, I think what that points to is how systematic returns to these subs, as we're seeing now with new camera systems with higher definition, we're able to learn so much more. Here we're getting a very good look at batteries inside. We can't tilt up as you were with a smaller camera to see that strap, but it all incrementally and sometimes dramatically adds to our understanding of what we're seeing, and in this case, further proof that this is the last of the 5 Midget subs involved in the Pearl Harbor attack. Its identity known to be a Pearl Harbor sub, likely, as we've heard from our colleagues in Japan, likely to be the boat launched by I-16. The first to be launched at 42 minutes past midnight on December 7th, and most likely waiting outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor, unable to get in, having been spotted by USS Condor and lying in wait until finally USS St. Louis came out, fired its torpedoes, and then after being shot at, submerged until close to the end of its battery power, its crew was able to send 2 signals, one suggesting that a successful attack had taken place, and the other then finally saying they were unable to navigate. And with that, then the charge, whose consequences we see on the other end of this sub, sent this vessel to the bottom, only to be rediscovered in 1951, quietly raised, cut into its other component part, and then dropped, only to be rediscovered in 1992, 2000, and 2001 by our colleagues with the University of Hawaii's Hawaii Undersea Research Lab.
One thing I might point out here, Jim, as long as you have your image up that shows the historic shot, there is about 10 feet of this section missing, where the stern section was disconnected and removed, and where the scuttling charge blew it off. So somewhere out there's another 10 feet of this that was part of the battery compartment.
Absolutely. And what I'm now putting up is Terry Kirby's illustration of that, showing how this submarine would have been configured and laid out, showing the stern section, showing the central section with the portion that is missing that Terry talked about. And you can see the battery compartments, and then the bow section. We are now on the top of the conning tower. pulley in the apparatus here, the shears or the guards at the top of the conning tower from which the forward wire for net cutting would be deployed. Look at the condition of the shell plating on the sail there.
Yeah, this one was really in advanced stages of decomposition. Is when we first found it, the conning tower was intact and the whole periscope was there. This has a little more of a lift to port, so it's the weight of the conning tower has made a lot of it fall away.
Tony Tully with a question.
Yes, Tony.
Is the scuttling charge, were they able to set it off in a way where they could escape if they had the option?
Tony Tully just asked if the scuttling charges were set, would the crew be able to escape? It is theoretically possible. What is interesting is that the submarine found in Kehi Lagoon, apparently an attempt had been made to light the scuttling charge, but it had not happened. As to whether or not that happened as they abandoned the boat, hard to say. Or did they fail and then abandon the boat? What we don't know is whether or not this hatch, while closed, is locked. What Pinot's letter did suggest, actually said, is that the body of a dead Japanese military person, they weren't sure if he was naval or army or a pilot they weren't sure if he was a pilot or not, I guess. There's the point. Had been found just inshore off a tripod reef, and strapped to his back was a sword. That is interesting in as much as we're not sure of how many pilots actually carried swords with them, but the Navy did recover Kazuo Sakamaki's family sword from his craft. The two Midget submarines sunk and entered by the Australians at Sydney. In both cases yielded the swords of the commanding officers. And so it is possible, if reading Pinot's letter, that the body that came ashore would be that of the commanding officer of I-16, Masaji Yokoyama, in which case, even after this charge was set, they potentially did get out. We just don't know. There's so many unsolvable, perhaps, mysteries associated with this. But what we can say for sure is, one, as we can see now as we're circling around it, that charge did go off, and it is a Pearl Harbor sub. And one of the ways we know that as well is that by now, just underneath the conning tower in that area, we would have seen the modifications that were added after Pearl Harbor for a trunk that connected these through the bottom to the mother sub. One of the things that happened on December 7th is that a couple of officers came along with their colleagues, making notes all the way on deficiencies and problems and things that needed to be corrected for the next missions. And one of those issues was having to climb out onto the mother sub on an open deck, climb up the side of the Kohai Oteki, go down into the hatch, down into the sub, and then deploy. So after that, all of the subs were modified, according to the Japanese, to have this trunk underneath, and the Sydney subs show that.
That is very interesting. I asked because just as I look at it, it's just a feeling, an intuition, nothing more positive than that. It just feels like a ship that was abandoned, that doesn't have bodies in it. It's just a feeling.
Yeah, I hear you. I do. It does have that sense of being something that was abandoned, and if that is the case, and that was Yokoyama who washed ashore, that body was recovered and buried, though we don't know what happened to that sword.
Mm-hmm. And so even the Sydney Midget has the modification.
Russ,
yes.
Honolulu, isn't it also true that the submarine crews, they wore the same flight suits that the pilots would have?
Yes.
Yeah, I hear you. I think it does have that.
So here you can see how badly deteriorated this submarine is as compared to the other. The sail here in and around the conning tower has fallen away. Terry, this is more than what we saw last time, isn't it?
Yeah, it looks like it's more open and more of that loose material has come off of the back part of the fairing on the sail.
The periscope is lying on the bottom just below. I can see it. I saw it when we came up.
Yeah, Jim, this is Hans. You may remember, but for those who wonder, that's the whole reason for that yellow bucket that's nearby the sub. In a past series of dives, when we were there with Terry, he indicated a light fixture, which was quite a diagnostic feature, that was lying underneath where this conning tower, this sail, will eventually collapse and cover. And so we made the call at the time to document that light feature in place on the seafloor next to the submarine, and then move it to a sand-filled bucket at a specific distance from the midsection. And that's the bucket that we see lying over on its side.
Hey guys, if you
Probably
can just
not
zoom in on the top
thereby.
and hold there, on the top of the conning tower. Thank you, Hans.
You can also see now the hole that was punched in the forward section that a cable was rigged in to rig this to dispose of it.
Right. So we'll talk about that really quickly. Before we do, for those of you watching the historical images, we've just put up the official naval portrait of the commanding officer of I-16 Masaji Yokoyama. There he is, and as well, his crew member, Sadamu Oyeda. We are at the top of the conning tower right now, and what you can see at the very top, just moving up a bit more, is where the periscope has broken off. The hatch is largely obscured in this area as well, just forward of it all the way over to the left side of the screen. Hold on just a second. Pilots, do you see the radio mast hole just over on the left edge of the conning tower on the top? Zoom in on that, please. So we're now moving in on the radio mast. This is a rubber-coated, hand-cranked mast that would be raised to send a signal. Like that on the Ward Midget, it is down. So what Terry Kirby was just commenting on, and I know some of you have been asking with questions online, why is this submarine in pieces? Sometime after the attack on December 7th, the crew set off their scuttling charge of Shimose powder, which blew open that after battery and detached the stern from the rest of the sub. The Pinot letter of 1956 says that when found in 1951, the two pieces of the sub were a few feet apart. The Navy quietly went out and raised this sub, and they did so by attaching cable and pulling it up and then cutting it into its component third piece. The stern had already been blown off, but in this case the bow was then severed at the joint line or its flange with a cutting torch, and this was determined, and Terry Kirby can talk a bit about this in one of the earlier missions of the Pisces. Terry, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, initially there was some controversy as whether the Navy would have disassembled the sub. Some thought that they would have gone through and disassembled it like they did Sakamakis, but as we know, by this time they knew as much as they wanted. So one of the things that we were able to do to determine exactly how it was disassembled was that we were able to scrape the flange joint on the forward end of this sub.
Move over towards the punched-in hole with the cable, please.
Bolt heads on that flange joint. And so each one of the sections, they actually cut the flange joint off and just sheared the bolt. So at that point, nobody climbed in the sub and disassembled it. It was cut off at the flange joints.
And there you really do see how clearly this was done. You can see how the hole was just simply punched in, and then this cable was threaded to lift this out of the water, and then loaded on a barge. Most likely these things were taken a few miles out to sea, rolled off and dumped to where we now find them. So in terms of archaeology, this isn't initial place where this happened. This is what we call a secondary deposition, which is fancy talk for meaning they took it and threw it here, as opposed to this being where it originally sank. Terry, have you guys been able to look into this hole like this before?
Yeah, we were able to look in there. We actually got up and tried to get a light in there. But you can see most of those batteries that we found when we put the camera into the other access hole have come out of their racks and when this was deposited, and have filled that compartment with loose batteries.
Right.
This hole is a little more opened up now than it used to be. It wasn't this large, but once again, this is really decomposing, and yeah, this hole is much more opened up than it was before.
So on the split screen historically, you can see these batteries as they looked historically. Pilots, if you can drop a target on this end of the sub as well. Roger.
Jim, that piece of metal or flashing with that color and that fastening pattern, it makes me think of a piece of aircraft that's blown onto the site, rolled in after the fact. What do you think?
Possibly so, yeah. As soon as if we could drift over there, that's when we can drop the target, guys. Let's do that before we proceed. We're going to head, we're fighting currents, as you can tell, ashore, but we're going to go to that end, and then hopefully we'll be able to look in at that end as well. See the thing that almost looks like rolled up carpet as well, Hans?
Yeah, that piece of rolled up carpet or rolled plastic has been there for some time. Once again, this is another little depression that was formed by current scouring where stuff collects.
So we're now at the forward end, and you can see the bulkhead that led into the forward battery compartment. Electrical cable coming out, as well as the larger cable looped by the Navy to lift this up.
That's the passageway there between compartments, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the that hatch led out of the forward
Jim,
battery
this
into
is
the bow.
Hans. We're looking at the rusticles that are coming down from the left side there on the flange, and Terry's remembering that's the area where they scraped in the flange to take the sediment sample, the corrosion samples, and so that increased slight impact right at that point is enough to create increased deterioration and corrosion and grow those rusticles.
Yeah, that's wild. I was looking at that. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, that was the area that we cleaned down to bare metal where we could see the sheared off bolts.
Well, it gave the bacteria something fresh to eat, didn't it? That's wild. So, yeah, I'm going to want to zoom. So, gentlemen, let's zoom in here and take a closer inspection of this end of the sub. Hans, do you guys see the same fitting that we saw? In a second, what you're going to see is something we caught a glimpse of, I think, inside the bow.
Yeah, so this, you can see the level, all these batteries that came out of the battery racks.
Perfect.
And filled that area up to the level, almost to the top of the door. So the hole in the side where we put the camera is just about right at that level.
Back out just a little, please. Perfect, thank you. Zoom in on the circular thing on the bottom, please. Could be. Shoreside, anything further that you want to see here?
If you could, zoom into that dripping corrosion, possible rusticle right off the flange on the port side, left side there, halfway down. But just get a close look at those because that is the scraping area. We have an image of that from when it was scraped, and those aren't there.
Right. Guys, do you see that orangey area that's got some rust bleeding off of it? Can you, to the left, can you zoom over onto that, please? Roger that. Rusticles.
I always thought that the classic rusticles were much slower to form, but if that's just, a lot of corrosion in a very slight impact area, then it speaks to this midsection as a whole, as a feature, reaching a little bit more of a stable state of deterioration. And in any spot where that's weakened, then that opportunity for the corrosion focuses on, that one tiny breach area and forms something that looks like this. It's an interesting note for site formation processes. Plus, I just think it looks cool.
And that wasn't that long ago.
Oh.
As we're looking at this, I think one thing that we should also point out is that one of our other partners is the Global Foundation for Ocean Exploration, and the team that is working these robots, providing what you're seeing, in addition to the crew on board the Okeanos Explorer, help make this happen. It's important to note, particularly in as much as we've come out of a time in which scientific exploration and discoveries usually have a name attached to them. And that's never been the case. I've been fond of telling folks that Neil and Buzz didn't land on the moon alone, and they would be the first to tell you that. In every case, in every place we go, there's a team of folks who make these things happen. So we specifically want to call out and thank our friends at GFOE as well. I would be remiss if I didn't thank the crew of Okeanos Explorer. As the robots are driving, this ship with direct positioning is also maneuvering. Our skilled crew is working on that, and the crew includes everybody from the engineers and the electricians who work to keep systems working and troubleshoot and repair them. It includes the stewards and the folks who have been making some incredible meals. It includes the deck crew. It includes everyone who has a role and plays a part in the ongoing saga of scientific exploration in the oceans. So thank you to all of them, as well as to all of those ashore. Just very quickly, guys, I would like to take a look just underneath the conning tower at two things, the fallen periscope and the yellow bucket. See the the linear feature, well, it's all rusty. That is likely the periscope. Want to zoom in on that? That's it.
It's been covered over.
In 2013, when we were here last, when I was here last with Hans, just before the mission in 2014, we noticed that the light fixture that is attached, the white light fixture that would be attached to this sub with a deterioration, had fallen out and was being buried by debris. As well, at the time we hadn't noticed that this periscope part was lying there. What we ended up doing in an effort to protect it, was to take that light fixture and put it into a yellow plastic bucket that we had, fill that with sand to isolate that artifact. The light fixture at some stage may very well have a serial number or something on it that would prove diagnostic and tell us more about whose sub it might be. That tub will be the next thing we take a look at, because we've noticed with some surprise as we came here that it is no longer where we left it and that it's been overturned. Though Terry Kirby had indicated you've seen fish do that thing, or sharks, I guess, right, Terry? Somebody's done it. Yes, please.
Yeah, I've
Roger,
seen,
into the bucket.
When we've had samplers set, I've actually seen a cook shark come in and take his nose and flip one of them over. They're very curious, so that may be what happened. But there are also some very strong currents out here, and we just set that bucket. The bucket is pretty much where we set it away from the wreck to keep it safe.
Yeah,
So it's possible the current could have blown that over as well.
Roger that. I want to see if that light fixture is still inside or if that's it lying just outside. It's roughly where we left it, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's where we left.
Yeah.
It's just tipped over.
Well, we didn't ask the shark before we left standing up in his house if it was okay.
So I think the light fixture is still buried in the sand. It looks like that was the bottom. It's just spilled a little sand out.
That's good.
It'd be the tag, I guess. Yeah, you see that, Hans, it looks like the tag is still in there?
Yeah, I got that. Since it's in the same place, it just is a little more stable now. I'll just leave it tipped over.
Yeah, no need to set it up right. Yeah, there it is. Okay, we're good to go. Okay, guys, we're good. We can call this section and try to find the next two pieces. Roger. Yeah, copy that. Yeah, thank you, Nav. So for those of you ashore, the ROV pilots are doing a watch change right now, shifting out. It's complicated and sometimes nerve-wracking to drive these robots on the bottom of the ocean when you consider not only the size of the vehicle and the cost of the vehicle, the sensitivity of the vehicle and the instrumentation on it, but also trying to navigate something dangling on the end of a very long line with current, in the darkness, flying remotely, and also doing this in the dark with sonar only to guide you.
Charlie.
Yes.
I was wondering, they said they may have found it in 1951. Do they know what part of the year?
Roger that. We are good to go to proceed to the next section. Stand by for a second. Terry Kirby?
Yes, Jim.
I think we're done here if you guys agree on ashore, and we're ready to proceed to the next piece. Would you give us some guidance?
The next piece is to the southwest, and it is roughly about 90 meters to the southwest.
Roger that.
And that was an excellent survey of this piece. That was really well done. That was a really good survey.
Thank you. Pilots, we're going to go to the southeast, right, Terry? Terry, southeast, southwest?
Yeah, to the southwest.
Pilots, we're going to go to the southwest. Southwest 90 meters to the next section.
And it'll be the stern section will be the next one we'll come to.
Roger that. Thank you, Terry.
Tony Tully with a question.
Go ahead, Tony.
It was found in 1951. Do they know what year it may have been? I mean, it was deposited in 1951. Do they know what month or what time of year it was?
Hold on, Tony. I'm sorry. I had other voices in my ear. I've turned them off so I can hear your question. Could you repeat?
Yes. It was deposited in 1951. Do they know what month or part of the year?
At this stage, we do not know what time that happened. All we know actually would have been the Vanderbilt expedition. I'm trying to remember. I believe was in the early summer. So it would have happened not too long after that. So I guess one of the next things we need to do is to figure out from logs who was out doing what with harbor maintenance. But it may have just been, this is pretty shallow water there by the hand buoy. They could have had whoever was doing buoy maintenance or work there just pick it up because it wouldn't have been that deep. But I'm trying to remember who was it that picked it up. Go ahead.
I was trying to consider in terms of the post-war. That's just about 5 years after the end of the war, just a little over. Why there seemed so little interest in it, or was that back when they thought there were still multiple ones?
A good question as to why they would have just taken it out and dumped it 6 years after the war. One of the points we make in the book is that having gone through the intelligence records, by 43 had pretty much decided there was nothing to be gained by examining these, other than going into subs to specifically get intelligence data, which would be chart cases, operational orders, things of that sort. So when, as well, there was also a memo stating that any operations whatsoever were not to be broadcast, and if anything was to be shared, it was that they were just simply messing around, which is certainly the case with some wartime released pictures of the U.S. CGC Ironwood working to raise one of these at Guadalcanal. And then it just said they were just messing around, and yet we do know from the records it was an intelligence operation, and what it ended up yielding was the operational orders for the Ko-Hayoteki Corps at Guadalcanal, as well as the operator's manual for how to drive the thing. And that sub ended up being the one that was taken back to the States and is on display at Groton, and that's Ha-8, or boat number 8 as they called it at the time. When they raised other subs later, we have the intelligence reports from raising them at Okinawa. They just simply picked up a more intact one and took a couple photos, and it's a very famous group of photos of that, and then they took it into deeper water and dumped it. So they really just didn't have much of an interest after 43. And so by 51, just yet another one, no big deal. But by 1960, it had already begun to pass into the realm of history, which is why we think the one found at Kehi Lagoon didn't just get taken out and sunk deeper.
That was interesting because I noticed in 1951 is also when they put a plaque on the Utah. I just didn't know if it meant there was more activity in that year or not.
Yeah, hard to say. I just think from what we saw from the Pinot letter, as it was read to us, was just basically Vanderbilt was out there and doing some dive ops, and they came across the submarine and reported it quietly, and SINCPAC said, destroy it.
Oh, okay. That explains it. Thank you.
So this is Bruce Mundy with the NOAA Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center. Early on, there was a question of what sort of life is in this area.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing a lot of pale eels swimming around as we cruise. These are snake eels. There are 2 species that occur at these depths, and they're a really good example of the type of fish that you see. There could also be some deep water flounders in this area, but these snake eels are cruising around just over the sediment, looking for small animals, little amphipods or other crustaceans for food. They can also bury in the sediment. So the pale eels that we're seeing are snake eels.
Thank you. For those of you just joining us, we are broadcasting live from the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, 5 nautical miles off the entrance to Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. On this occasion of the 75th anniversary of the attack of Pearl Harbor, we are diving on 2 targets, Midget submarines, now known as mini submarines, known originally as Kohaoteki in Japan. These craft were used in the attack. 5 were launched. 1 made it inside, and after launching its torpedoes was then sunk by ships inside Pearl Harbor. The others did not make it in. 1 was washed ashore and captured the following morning. 1 was sunk by the duty destroyer USS Ward just before the attack, and that was the target we dived this morning. 2 others were subsequently found after the war on both sides of the entrance to Pearl Harbor's entrance channel. One of those is this submarine, which was found in 1951, and then after being cut into its component pieces, was taken out and dropped in deeper water. The fifth and final was found in 1960 by U.S. Navy divers, raised, and after its bow was removed because the torpedoes could not be safely extracted, the remainder of that sub was returned to Japan. We should be heading towards the tail. Pilots, we should be heading towards the tail.
We do have a sonar target coming up.
You're hearing the voice of Frank Cantellis, archaeologist with NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, who joins us here on Okeanos Explorer as one of the co-leads of the dive on board the ship. Frank, Okeanos Explorer and the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research have seen some interesting things on the bottom, both biologically and geologically, but also archaeologically. This year in particular was a pretty interesting one.
Yes, it was a very interesting year this year on the Okeanos Explorer. And thanks to telepresence, all of us in Silver Spring were able to join in on some of these dives, just like the folks online are now. But earlier this year, the ship was off Tinian Island near Saipan. Tinian Island was an air base in World War II, and we were very interested in looking for lost aircraft off the island. B-29 bombers flew missions to Japan from Tinian, and we did a lot of mapping in that area, located a target, which we weren't really sure was an aircraft or not based on our sonar information, but we took a chance and made a dive on it, and we found a B-29 bomber lost in World War II there. Very significant find. Not many, actually I don't think any aircraft have been found in deep water around Tinian or Saipan, although there are aircraft in shallower water. So that was a significant discovery. We had really good partnerships with the Saipan Historic Preservation Office, and the Defense POW MIA accounting agency as well. And then later in the summer, we were working near Wake Island. And Wake Island was the scene of an early battle in World War II when Japanese forces attacked the island just after the attack on Pearl Harbor. They made several attempts to take the island, and in those attempts lost a couple ships to American batteries on Wake. So we went there with the intention of mapping and looking for targets, and we did find a nice target, shipwreck target we wanted to take a look at. And so later in the summer we came back and made an unexpected discovery. Actually, we were looking for a Japanese warship, and
there we go.
Found an auxiliary Japanese merchant vessel that supplied water to Japanese forces on the various islands. Well, it looks like we're heading to the next section of the wreck here.
That would be the stern.
Have an object on the bottom we're looking at now. Hans and Terry, have you examined this before? It looks like a rock from here, but I'm not sure.
It looks like a rock.
Yeah, that's a rock, and we're coming on to the stern, and when we get up, you can see one of the first things that we noticed when we found this was that it had been rigged. There was cables that were choked up around the stern. What we noticed on the bow section and the mid section, they both had holes punched in them that had cables passed through, but it looks like on the stern here that they just choked a cable around the tail, and that is draped over the area around the stern.
In the split screen, you can see a historic image of the stern section of Kazuo Sakamaki's submarine captured ashore. And that gives you a sense, again, just the relative size that we're looking at. Those marks are in feet. And you can see the dive planes at the stern. And you can also see the counter-rotating propellers for those of you that joined us for the dive on the Midget submarine sunk by the Ward. You notice the same area. You can also see, as Terry's pointed out, the cables used by the Navy to raise this off of the bottom from its original position and then taken, before it was taken out here and dumped. You can also see, Hans, the others, you see the damage there at the stern, corrosion that's opening up the hull there in and around the area of the gearing mechanism for the motor.
Yeah, this was pretty intact when we found it in 1992. So this is all recent, and once again, advanced stages of decomposition, and it is sort of broken there, and the stern section settled. So the interesting thing is that what we see on the midsection and on the stern section, it just seems to be crumbling apart. But the bow section, still with the classic figure-8 torpedo guards, was the last time we were down here, was still in pretty good shape.
And that's going to be our next target after this. Pilots, we're going to just circumnavigate this slowly. Our stop. Yeah, sorry guys. We just want to circle this guy slowly. The one thing that we also want to do is at both ends we'll pause and just grab some really good footage by sitting still. We will be seeing at the forward end of this is
those will be good places to take targets as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Hold for a second, guys. I'd like to get, we're going to drop targets, yeah, both ends. And after we drop the targets again, we're going to slowly circumnavigate this, but at each end we'll line up and just take some time to capture. The forward end, the bigger end, has the electric motor in it, and we want to make sure we get some good captures of that and some zooms. Sure, I'm sure you copied all of that as we were talking to the pilots. Add as you see.
Jim, this is Hans. The way that cable lies there in that type of corrosion, that hole, it just makes me think of galvanic coupling between maybe a cable that was more noble in nature than the steel of the hull, and the hull did the decomposition for the cable. Just a possibility.
Good point.
The other thing too is that it was that was the weak point.
Yeah.
Where the whole bow section was dropping. I mean the forward section was dropped away. As you can see, it was in this sort of a crater. So the first found that was intact, and this has settled down. And so I think that's what.
Oh, there's a berm right there.
Yeah, there's a berm right there. And that forward section has settled into that.
Right.
Yeah.
Tully here.
Go ahead. Yeah, Tony.
Is there any speculation why the deterioration is so fast in like the last 5 or 10 years of various wrecks?
One of the things we're seeing with deterioration, Tony, is that things seem to hold for a while with a relative state of equilibrium, and then for any variety of reasons they start to go, and it may be that they hold for a point, and then there's the next stage of decomposition that happens. And it's something that we're increasingly grappling with as we try to manage these sites. And by say manage, I say that with every, ironic twist to the thought of human beings trying to manage something like this sitting at the bottom of the sea. By managing it, we come, we look, we monitor. But is this something that we would necessarily argue to pick up and preserve? Likely not, just because it's so far gone. It's also a war grave. And so in this case, by managing it, we monitor it, and we allow it to slowly return to the elements. In other cases, if this was the last example, if there was something that could be done, then one would argue that then there's recovery that happens, as was the case with the USS Monitor, where portions of, in some cases, entire craft are raised.
Oh, yeah.
But you're looking at something all told that with recovery and treatment would cost into the tens of millions of dollars, and you have to argue what the priority is in terms of paying for that as opposed to other things. So that's all. One of the reasons why we do the dives is looking at all that and trying to understand how fast these things go. What has been interesting is that since we didn't immediately start making dives in the past, we don't know at what stage this thing began to change. So the other day when we dived on the more modern wreck of the Royal Taipan, a wooden vessel, we saw that there was a fair amount of it seemingly there, and yet you look closer and we saw that colonization had happened, marine creatures had been eating the wood, that there were definite changes, and in another 5 years we may come back and that's completely collapsed. Here, because we have had some periodic dives, major science missions, say 2009, the 2013 dives, the 2014 dives, we're getting a more detailed sense of it all. And there's been corrosion study that's been done here with our colleagues in the Park Service, and particularly by Dr. Don Johnson, the University of Nebraska. We're learning more, but there's still so much more we need to learn. And why this is pertinent is not just, say, for historic preservation. If we have ships that are sitting on the bottom, as we know, with many of them from World War II, that still have oil cargoes, at what stage does it get to this point where that oil comes out, and perhaps catastrophically? How does this work in deep ocean environments where we know, for example, we have Russian submarines and a couple of our own, but primarily the Russian submarines, and let's talk specifically about the Russian subs with reactors that got sunk in the Arctic Ocean. When does that metal get like this, and when does that stuff come out? So that's why part of the mission is looking at the questions of corrosion coupled to the potentially polluting wreck issue, but also looking at what happens with historic preservation. So there's no simple or easy answer at this stage. We're just still gathering data, and as you've heard in some of the discussion, trying to figure out why we have this damage here. Hans has suggested perhaps some sort of an electrolytic reaction, a cathodic reaction. This is also an area where that cable was looped, and where at the time when this was lifted, see how localized this damage is? On both sides, this could be where that cable initially choked. That metal was stressed and cracked, and then over time, it has failed in the area where it had its greatest stress when this was lifted out of the water. It's one of the things we've been looking at, too, with, say, the wreck of the USS Independence, which off the coast of California, when we dived on it, we're looking at metal which went through 2 atomic blasts. And while we know that it is no longer radioactive, we also know that with peak overpressures of 6,000 psi, that steel may very well have been fractured to a point where it will deteriorate faster, which is something we're seeing. We're seeing levels of deterioration like this on the ships at Bikini. Having dived on Saratoga and Nagato and Anderson and Lamson and the others, I'm shocked at how much change has taken place even from my first dive, say, on Nagato in 1989 to where she is now.
And the cruiser Sakawa, I believe, right, has really deteriorated. Yeah,
and because Sakawa actually ended up having the Baker bomb slung more or less above her for the second test when they repositioned the target array at Bikini. So, yeah.
And you see this also with the Jutland wrecks, the rapid change over a few years.
Absolutely.
Okay, I was just curious if there's some common cause figured out, but still gathering data.
Still gathering data.
Thank you.
And I am no metal scientist, nor am I playing one on TV today. So here, as you can see, folks, as we're talking our science as well as the history, every time we go, every time we look, we're learning something new. We're monitoring ongoing changes as this submarine gradually returns to the elements. We're also looking at marine biology. We're looking at colonization of wrecks. We're looking at ongoing changes as a result of that. We're looking at how shipwrecks in time become artificial reefs. And to answer to one question, as this metal deteriorates, the steel and the iron in it in particular becomes food for fish. So rusting metal, rusting iron in particular, rusting steel is not an environmental problem, unless in some cases we've seen where it's lying directly on top. You have a modern metal wreck on top of coral reef, where it does have an impact. But here on the bottom, this is merely feeding life, serving as a platform for life, but it's also feeding it. And here we are looking inside the stern section.
Do you know about where in the stern section the electric motor would be located?
It's just forward of this. We're in an area now. This should have been a free-flooding oil-filled space with gearing. Did I say free-flooding? I didn't mean that. I meant long day. This
sealed space oil.
A sealed space filled with oil, in which the gears are. Yeah. Sorry, this day started at 3 a.m. My apologies, folks. So again, for those of you who are watching, we are broadcasting live from the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, moored 1,500 feet above the remains of an Imperial Japanese Navy Kohaoteki Type A Midget submarine, now known as a mini submarine. These craft, 5 in total, were launched by the Imperial Japanese Navy's I-boats off the coast of Pearl Harbor in the early morning hours of December 7th, 1941, 75 years ago today. No. It's a shell. So keep going. And pilots, as we come around to this end, we're going to swing around it, and I want to look into that blunt end. We're going to be we're going to be looking into the area with the electric motor. The gears were in an oil-filled area. The rest of it, no.
For 1,500 feet above the remains of an Imperial Japanese Navy Kohaoteki Type A Midget submarine, now known as a mini submarine. These craft, 5 in total, were launched by the Imperial Japanese Navy I-boats off the coast of Pearl Harbor in the early morning hours.
And there you go. There's your motor. So as we were saying, we are looking at an Imperial Japanese Navy Midget submarine used in the Pearl Harbor attack. Earlier this morning, we were looking at the one that was sunk in the early morning hours before the aerial assault by the vigilant crew of the USS Ward, U.S. Navy destroyer on guard duty, alerted to it by the crew of the USS Antares and also by Lieutenant William Tanner flying over and patrolling the harbor entrance in his PBY aircraft. These craft were powered by batteries and propelled by an electric motor, and that is exactly what we're looking at right now. Do we have Burl Burlingame on?
Yes, we do.
Excellent. Burl Burlingame, if you're able to comment, we'd love to hear from you. For those of you out there, Burl Burlingame is the author of the definitive account of the destroyers that guarded this area, as well as the Midget subs. Advanced Force Pearl Harbor is one of those books that I've kept on my shelf through the years as a regular reference source and as an inspiration. And certainly Burl was a very big help with all of us in the science team as we've worked on these subs archaeologically. Burl, you there?
So as we were saying, we were looking at an Imperial Japanese Navy Midget submarine used in the Pearl Harbor attack. Earlier this morning, we were looking at the one that was sunk in the early morning hours before the aerial assault by the vigilant crew of the USS Ward, U.S. Navy destroyer on guard duty, alerted to it by the crew of the USS Antares and also by Lieutenant William Tanner flying over and patrolling the harbor entrance in his PBY aircraft. These craft are powered by batteries and propelled by an electric motor.
So when you're in position more or less straight on, we want to just hold and zoom in, and then as we move past it, we want to drop a target at this end as well. There's a fair amount of cable lying there.
There sure is. So these things could go up to what, about 20 knots?
Yes.
It's pretty fast.
Some of the work that is being done out here, in addition to that done by the University of Hawaii's team with the Hawaii Undersea Research Lab, has also involved work by NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, which has two National Marine Sanctuary areas, one a National Marine Monument, the other a sanctuary here in Hawaii. That is Hawaii Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary and Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument. Joining us ashore is Dr. Hans Conrad Van Tilburg, who is the Maritime Heritage Program Coordinator for NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries in the Pacific, and also ashore at the Bofin Museum, answering questions, interacting with the public, and participating in these dives is Dr. Kelly Gleason-Keough, who is the archaeologist for Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument. Both of whom have worked extensively in a variety of sites out here, downed aircraft from the war as well as shipwrecks. Hans Van Tilburg in particular has worked on one other aspect of the Pearl Harbor attack, which are PBY aircraft that were engaged in the battle early on and destroyed on the water by attacking Japanese aircraft at Kaneohe. Hans, one of the things that you've pointed out as we've worked on all of this is that for most people, Pearl Harbor and the battle has been largely focused in many eyes on what happened in Battleship Row with the larger ships. And yet, this is a battle that took place in three dimensions, both the air, underwater, as we're seeing, and on the surface. You might want to talk a little bit about that and about some of the other work and about Pearl Harbor as a, quote-unquote, Pearl Harbor as a larger battle.
Sure, Jim. Thanks. You know, I think it would be hard to overstate the significance, the importance of December 7th, 1941, and what it meant for these islands, the territory of Hawaii, what it meant for the Pacific, and for our country and others. And there's no question about that, but we remember that that was 2 hours on December 7th, and soon after that, martial law was declared in the territory, which lasted almost 3 years. The years of intense activity that took place in the Hawaiian Islands changed this state like no other. And this was the launching pad as well as the rest and recreation center for the Pacific effort. The types of training that went on here was hazardous. There were hundreds of naval aircraft lost during training in the skies over the Hawaiian waters. And there were scores of vessels, Amtraks, and landing craft lost, and lives lost simply during the training that took place here. So for me, it's not just the importance of Pearl Harbor and these artifacts, these sites and locations, which certainly are incredibly significant to us and filled with important memory, but all of the resources, all of the cultural footprint left from those war years. I think if we went back to those times from now, we wouldn't recognize the islands of Hawaii. There were bazooka ranges, tank ranges, artillery firing zones, aerial practice zones for combat and for dive bombing. There was blackout, curfew, barbed wire on the beaches, rationing of food, rationing of fuel, and martial law and suspension of habeas corpus. So they call it home front for a reason. There are sacrifices made in war, in combat, and there are sacrifices that residents and civilians and American citizens make at home. And Hawaii certainly saw a good part of those. Now, in reference to the training that went on here and the types of resources we look for, it's not just the combat losses, which are very important, but the losses during training. And when you look at the inventory of military properties, ships, submarines, and aircraft lost in the waters around the Hawaiian Islands, you get a larger sense for the commitment and logistical and material capacity of the United States in the mid-20th century. there are at least 1,400 U.S. naval aircraft splashed into the waters around the Hawaiian Islands, most of which, of course, lost during training, hazardous training, but training, non-combat conditions. And then there are somewhere between 80 or 90 naval aircraft, naval surface ships and submarines that we know of lost and intentionally disposed around the islands. And so that's a rather large resource, and it's a comment on the importance of the Hawaiian Islands, the importance of Pearl Harbor and the other naval and Army and military facilities here in Hawaii for us as a nation.
Thank you, Hans. We just had a comment in from Burl Burlingame, who says that Hawaii has the third highest number of aircraft crash sites in the U.S., almost all of which were in water. Terry Kirby, as I recall, one of the first maritime heritage discoveries you guys made was a remarkably intact Dauntless. Was it not still painted?
Yeah, that was off of Cocoa Head and about 700 feet of water. That was in the mid-'80s with the first submersible we operated.
Okay, we can back out and proceed around.
That we made was totally intact with the insignias still on the side, the guns stowed, and we were actually able to find the situation report. It was in a training exercise, and they splashed it and were able to get out of the plane.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, pilots. If we've dropped the target at this end, let's just work our way around the other end, and then we are, unless we hear from shore, we are done with this target, and we can move on to our third and final. So as we pull away, I mean, some of you probably noticed there was life inside there. Anybody ashore, Chris, anybody else, you want to comment on what we saw and how these wrecks do become habitat?
Well, I stepped out for lunch, I have to admit, so I wasn't watching a lot of that, but there was a crab in there, sort of a type of a hermit crab. There was also a shrimp, and those two I saw, and this, of course, going inside of a hole like this is good for crustaceans that are prone to get eaten by other large fish and other things. So those types of animals are always looking for places to hide. Bruce was watching here for a while, and there's a couple of fish around it. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, again, we're seeing more of these snake eels swimming around that we saw at the previous site and in between. And again, the shrimp that we saw inside the hull was probably taking shelter from predators like those snake eels. There was also a fish sitting on the bottom with a distinct black bar across its eyes. We've seen several of those and haven't commented on them. They're lurking predators. They sit on the bottom. They're called duckbill fishes. And again, they sit and wait to ambush small prey that might swim up. The hermit crab's kind of interesting because there's actually a sea anemone attached to the back of the crab, and that's a symbiotic relationship. I don't know if we know exactly how that happens, but the anemone has stinging tentacles and gives some protection to the crab. And the crab, as it feeds, breaks off particles of its food, and the anemone might get little bits of food from the feeding of the crab, so they both benefit from that relationship.
Excellent. Thank you. One important thing to remember, again, for those of us that you're joining, knowing that some of us work with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we have our National Fisheries Service, and many experts, many scientists who understand, to document, work to protect, as well as see a sustainable fishery with that which lives in our nation's waters. That ranges from shallow water all the way down to the deepest reaches of the ocean and every sort of marine life. And a reminder that as our colleagues in the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research with Okeanos Explorer and with funded missions go out into the oceans, Many times the discoveries that are made are known examples, places like this where a wreck has been used as habitat, but also what's being discovered is new life. And so, as we're fond of saying, with a particular nod to a certain science fiction show, when we go, we boldly go where none have gone before, and occasion like this, where we already have, seeking new life, as well as you can see here, evidence of that which we have accomplished, for better or for worse, with our civilization. Copy that. We're good with that. Yes. So again, just before we depart the stern section of this Midget submarine, we're taking a look at and measuring corrosion. Measurement is the beginning of most science. From this, we can then come back in later years and see how much further these holes have opened and deteriorated, and with that, begin to have a measurable scale from which we can begin to forecast into the future where certain shipwrecks are going to end up over time. And by end up, I mean going back into their elements at the bottom of the sea. What you see tangled around the dive planes and the two aft counter-rotating propellers here is a large amount of wire cable which has been looped around the entire stern. This was done by the United States Navy when this submarine was recovered from its shallower water grave off the entrance to Pearl Harbor in 1951, and then taken out here and dumped into deeper water. Overall, and then we're good to go. So at the very tail end here, just past the loop, you can see the blades of the two counter-rotating propellers. That is a feature still used in submarines to this day. And I think it's important to note with that while these craft failed in their mission to, for the most part, only one made it in, but failed to enter Pearl Harbor and launch their torpedoes, something for which we as the United States are eternally grateful, but recognizing the loss of 9 of these Midget submariners, the Kohauteki Corps with their craft, 2 of whom died with the loss of this submarine we're now looking at, though at a different location than where this rests. It's important to remember that the failure of the mission did not mean these craft in and by themselves were failed. During the war, these craft were ridiculed, elevated to almost mythical status on one side, ridiculed on the other side, particularly given their seemingly small size and the fact that they had not succeeded in going into Pearl Harbor and attacking and sinking ships. By the same token, others of this type used in different theaters of war, at Guadalcanal, in the Aleutians, at Saipan, and in Sydney, Australia, where 3 of these were deployed to penetrate the harbor, attack and sink ships. There they were more successful in getting into the harbor, though the torpedoes missed and sank only the old ferry Cuttable, which was being used as a barracks and drowned a number of sailors, the torpedoes having missed the USS Chicago, which was nearby. The other subs caught in the anti-submarine nets or wires ended up being destroyed by their crews with self-detonating charges. The record was not impressive, but I want to go back to what these subs were designed for. When designed, these craft were amongst the most sophisticated small submarines in the world. Their batteries were second to none. Their electric motors were exceptional, even as we pass the corroded and broken remains of the one here in this stern section. These craft were capable in trials of doing better than 20 knots, which is a very fast speed. They were capable of extended runs with their batteries. And as designed, had these been launched from a seaplane tender, swarming in the open ocean as part of a larger sea battle, they certainly would have seen more effect. But having said that, these craft were then taken and used as stealth weapons in an effort to bring them into the war when it was clear there would not be an all-out decisive open water battle as the Japanese Navy had planned for and trained for. In that, these craft, sophisticated, difficult to use and maneuver, were not put into their best situation. And indeed, the crews who had trained in them and continued to train found, even as the first guy had done it, and we have the notes from his initial examination, these craft are difficult to keep trim. These craft were difficult to keep steering straight. These craft were difficult to do anything but to just push forward and to launch and then go back to their mothership. When in the aftermath of the attack, these craft, which were essentially, as Burl Burlingame has pointed out, submersible torpedo boats, when used in this capacity at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese officer, the admiral who had overseen the program, was said to have burst into tears and blurted out, "This is murder, and I would have never designed this boat if I'd known this was going to happen and these boys were going to die." And indeed, with that as well, these craft were not designed as toku, or suicide weapons. They were designed to fight and to come back. We're passing a piece of ordnance there. That's a battleship shell. Yeah, nice. So there's a lot of things that have been deposited here on the bottom, in addition to these subs. And here we see a piece of ordnance discarded. Not one of ours. A lot of stuff was dumped out here. But coming back to these subs, they were not designed to be suicide weapons. They were designed to fight and to come back and then be reused again. At the end, going towards the end of the war, some of the Ko Hayoteki Corps, these guys that had trained in this, young, full of ambition, full of love of country, full of concern for their families as the war turned badly, a number of them began to advocate for different tactics. And indeed, finally, two sub-lieutenants, argued that a new weapon be developed that gave away all pretense of ever coming back, but essentially a modified torpedo that a man would sit in and with rudimentary controls steer into the side of a ship. That weapon, developed in 1944, was known as kaiten, or a means by which to change fortunes or shift heaven. A number of officers trained and went into these craft, as did enlisted men. More of them died in training trying to steer those unwieldy craft than died in actual combat operations. In the end, the Kaiten Corps were able to sink only two vessels, one of them the fleet oiler Mississinawa at Ulithi Atoll. And by the time the war ended, far more had died training and using these midget subs than would ever have been lost in an operational combat situation, having achieved some measure of success. It speaks powerfully to a couple of things, but most particularly I'm reminded of one Japanese submarine officer that I personally knew, who I interviewed one night in Tokyo, having talked with him at length about his colleagues, about his service in the war, and ultimately how he had come to be a human torpedo. It was 1944, and as he was at the naval base with many of their other vessels lost and with our own ships coming in and actively sinking and putting most of Japan's warships and merchant fleet on the bottom, these guys locked into, as Burl Burlingame has pointed out, a Navy that was fixated more on tactics than on strategy, and a group that had really, as Burl has said, never developed a weapon that they couldn't wait to try out. Instead then went to this new form of weapon. And what this guy said was he's standing there with everybody else, and the CO of the base came out and told them all, "So you know that we're winning the war. You hear it on Radio Tokyo." He said, "Well, that's not true. It's a lie." We see a bit of sorry to interrupt, but we're seeing a bit of aircraft here, most likely dumped after the war. Anyway, he said, "So we're not winning the war, but there's a new weapon that's been developed. You all know the story of the divine wind that blew and saved Japan. Well, this time the divine wind is going to blow again, but this time, you lucky so-and-sos, you will be the divine wind. I need 200 volunteers for a new weapon. I asked him what did he do. He said, I was standing at rigid attention, looking out of the sides of my eyes at the guys on either side of me who were looking at me that way. I said, did it strike you as kitschy guy or crazy? He said, of course it struck me as crazy. He said, but what do? He said, you guys were coming, we were dying, and we also knew that the militarists in Tokyo had announced that everybody would die together to save the emperor. But if we could keep you away, if we could push you off, if we could get the United States to accept terms as opposed to invading us where we committed national suicide, if I could save my family, I would do this. And so I stepped forward, and so too did everyone else. And as we talked, and actually he had a tear come out of his eye that night as we sat there and talked into the early morning hours, I asked him how he felt about it. He said, to this day, I am sorry that I didn't go and die with my shipmates, and I'm also happy and relieved I did not. And he had never spoken of this, not even to his own family. I think it's important to remember that and to tell stories like this. And Toshiharu Kanata, who blessed me with sharing this story, is now gone. But I'll never forget the gift he gave me of sharing that insight. A former enemy, now a dear friend, and somebody that I prized and cared about till the end of his days, and we stayed in touch until he was gone. And a reminder that ultimately it is a story of people, human beings that get caught up in things sometimes bigger than themselves. And that's what Kanata said to me. Son, have you ever been stuck in something bigger than you? And my answer to him was, no, sir, nothing quite like that. We have now moved off of our target and are moving to the third and final piece as we pass other debris dumped by the Navy, and that is the bow section of this Midget submarine. ROV pilots are navigating. We're using sonar as well as the guidance of Terry Kirby and the Hawaii Undersea Research Lab team. Again, Cullen Wallerman, Steve Price, Max Kramer, Terry Kirby, Chris Kelly, so many others through the years, working from the university with the Pisces 4 and Pisces 5 submersibles, have explored this area, making fantastic discoveries in biology, oceanography, geology, and maritime archaeology. Terry has been working with us. Some of these guys are ashore with us now. You've heard from Terry. And these wonderful partners in ocean exploration have helped guide and define the dives that we're making today. Again, we're broadcasting to you live from the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, America's ship for ocean exploration. It's your vessel, and for those of you joining us from the public, we're privileged that on this occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, to take you into the deep waters off Pearl Harbor, where evidence of that attack remains in the form of these two Midget submarines that we have previously dived, to bring to you, thanks to telepresence, experts like Burl Burlingame, who wrote the book on these Midget subs, Tony Tully, another great accomplished historian who knows this story very well, the team from Hawaii's Undersea Research Lab, my colleagues in NOAA, Frank Cantellis, the archaeologist with the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, Hans Van Tilburg, the Maritime Heritage Coordinator for the Pacific Islands for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, Kelly Gleason-Keogh, archaeologist for Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument, fellow historians and broadcast filmmakers like Russ Matthews, who led the 2014 expedition to these subs, and so many others. And I know I'm going to be getting in trouble here as I stop saying thank you to so many people, but just end with a very heartfelt thank you to everybody that makes this happen, to make sure that not only are we sharing with each other and other scientists and gathering data, but we're also sharing this live as it happens with all of you out there who are the public. We're ever mindful of the fact that we work for you, and the work that we do is focused on important stories as well as important aspects like better understanding the waters off our own coasts, because indeed those waters, particularly those that are controlled by the United States, are important to our national economy, understanding and charting their bottom to keep commerce flowing in and out of ports, monitoring the weather that these oceans help drive and influence, understanding the fisheries that thrive here with more than half of our food coming from these oceans, as well as understanding our heritage as it's reflected here. All of that is key and important and part of the mission of NOAA, as well as the other agencies with whom we work, to include, particularly out here, the United States Navy with its Navy History and Heritage Command, as well as the Serving Navy, and as well our colleagues with agencies like the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, the National Park Service, and our colleagues there, both at Valor in the Pacific National Historical Park and the Submerged Resources Center, our colleagues with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and our many colleagues and partners in the nonprofit world and the academic world. As we said earlier, as this mission is unfolded, this is all about teamwork. No one of us alone makes this happen. It's collectively together, working to a purpose and working for the public.
Those waters, particularly those controlled by the States, are important to our national economy.
Tully here.
Tully, yes, Tony, go ahead.
Commerce flowing in and out of ports, monitoring the weather within the ocean to help thrive and influence.
Go ahead, Tony, we hear you.
Just briefly off topic, with this new kind of survey gear, has someone ever done recently underwater survey of the Utah wreck in Pearl Harbor?
Yes, the USS Utah has been surveyed both by the National Park Service and with a number of their partners, including our good friends at Autodesk. They've done 3D high-resolution laser scans of not only Utah but of Arizona, and they've also, using submersibles, including some very nifty smaller ones that deploy and reel in their own cable. They've gone inside Arizona and documented areas where we know nobody is. And some of those images, powerful and compelling, have just been released, including uniforms still hanging in cabins, and in one case lying on a bunk in the cabins of officers who survived the attack. So that work has been amazing, and I particularly want to call out those folks. One of the neatest things I've seen, Tony, is when we were in San Francisco getting ready to sail with Ballard on our last mission, the Autodesk folks showed us some of the work they'd done, and we were able to see a 2-scale detailed 3D printout of the wreck of Arizona that was done through those surveys, and to such a degree that seriously you could take that if you had a big enough printer and did it in pieces, you could print a full-scale replica.
That's amazing.
We're now working
when
on
was the last time Utah was done?
Utah, just a couple years ago.
Is that available somewhere, or how do you see the image?
Some of it was online. Autodesk and some of the others have put it on. I think a good Google search, if you strung it out in a Boolean way, USS Utah, underwater scans, Autodesk, somebody like that, some of the other partners, it would show up. Some of those images are downloadable.
Autodesk, okay. Okay, Autodesk. That's auto and desk, like a desktop?
Yes, and it's one word. Also, National Park Service Submerged Resources Center.
I did not know a recent one had done, just the earlier one, in the early 90s or late 80s.
Right, I was part of the late 80s ones, and with that we were swimming over all of this stuff in Pearl Harbor and drawing it on Mylar, frosted Mylar with lead stretching tapes. Very different time, but I will always remember my dives with my colleagues on the Arizona as well as the Utah. Powerful place to be, in particular, to swim along that hull, to see that ship, and in my case to have been able to participate in interring one of the Arizona survivors' ashes inside the ship. Very powerful and emotional thing. But You take that and then you consider something like swimming over that wreck underneath the memorial. And I recall looking down in the water, and because people stand on the memorial, things fall in the water. So we saw cameras, we saw camera lens caps, we saw berets from hair, we saw hairbrushes, but then every so often what you would see were photographs. And every once in a while these photographs were relatively new, and they were fading and curling in the water, but you could still look at them. And what struck me is that they were pictures, in many cases, of older women with white hair standing there with a family group. And it suddenly struck me that what I was looking at were widows coming back with their grown children and grandchildren to share that with their dead husbands, or maybe their dead brothers, or maybe fathers, who were still there eternally inside the Arizona. It's a reminder of how powerful these places are and why we dive and do these things as we do. For Japanese families, who for the first time most likely have been able to see these two craft on the bottom of the ocean as it happens, as we explore them, it's where their family members rest. It's their touchstones. And for generations yet to come, as these continue to melt into the bottom, if we visit them again, they will forever be reminders of what happened here 75 years ago.
That's very profound. I have not heard about pictures.
Randy Sasaki's joined us again.
Excellent. So we have Randy Sasaki joining us from Japan. Randy is an archaeologist whose work has included amazing documentation of the fleet sent by Kublai Khan to invade Japan in 1281. That fleet's demise at the hands both of the samurai, but also thanks to a powerful storm that came up after the samurai stalled the fleet from landing their troops, was set down in Japanese legend evermore as the divine wind, or the kamikaze. Ohayo gozaimasu, Sasaki-san. Thank you for joining us. So for those of you joining us, we're continuing to move and navigate with the ROV, moving the ship along with it as we move into the area where the last section of this Midget submarine is located. This would be the bow section. With this as well, for all of you who are joining us, you get to see underwater exploration as it really happens live. And that means that, like the rest of us, you spend a lot of time driving over a bottom, looking at sand, looking at water go by, and then all of a sudden, out of the darkness, there it is. When we see it for the first time, you will too. So we were just asked if there's books to read, and there's a few. If you go to Amazon or another site, you can read Burl Burlingame's Advanced Force Pearl Harbor. Another is an older book by Peggy Warner and Sadao Seno called Coffin Boats. And most recently, with a number of the team participating from this dive, a book published by Texas A&M University Press called The Lost Submarines of Pearl Harbor, illustrated with a number of historic images, fair amount of research drawn from Japanese, American, Australian, and other sources, and with photographs and illustrations of the submarines as discovered and the archaeology of those craft. All of those available online, and the proceeds from the last book that we all participated in go to charity. What is that?
I am not sure what that is. Looks pretty big, but it's
that is a big pile of chain. It's decomposing pretty well, but yeah, there was a huge pile of chain that looked like it was actually in some kind of a container that rotted away and left this pile. I think that the bow section should be just beyond this, as I recall.
Roger, pilots, go past this stack of chain here. In the distance, I think I see the bow, and Kirby thinks he sees it too. Thanks, Terry. I was beginning to wonder, but then we just saw something in the dark, and you, I think you called it. There it is. There it is. Yeah.
Yep, that's it.
So for those of you joining us, if you look on the screens, in the darkness, coming out just ahead past this, what looks like a rock, but which is a pile of chain which is rusted together, the bow section of this Midget submarine is beginning to emerge from the murk. Good driving, guys. Well done. For those of you out there who are parents of children who play video games, I just want to specifically call out right now on behalf of all the ROV pilots and the NAVs that it's an essential skill. And that child that you encourage to play that video game today most likely will be sitting in front of us in the future as an active, absolutely necessary partner in science, driving robotic vehicles as we explore the oceans as well as what's up there. And I just got a big high five from the ROV team, so yeah. The best part of that means that even as adults, they can actually play these games and call it work training. Love it. So as well, for those of you joining us on a little more serious note, and I was serious, by the way, on the games being training, you may notice that it takes some time. As we approach, you just can't drive straight at it. That's because as we move this robotic vehicle on its tether, and the one above it on its tether, we also have to move the ship. And so as part of the synchronized work, the ballet that happens in the water, both on the surface and in the water column, with the mariners, the navigators, the ocean... The NOAA Corps officers and the crew on Okeanos Explorer, they're working hand in glove with the ROV nav team. So the ship moves, dynamically positioned to hold its place as it continues to move, as the ROVs move. And there's two of them. The one above, which gives you the downward view, and then the one approaching. And now, as that's all happened and as those moves have synchronized, we are approaching the last piece of this Midget submarine. This is the bow section. For those of you who joined us on the earlier dive, we saw the bow of the Midget sub sunk by the USS Ward. its torpedoes with their caps still in place, but with its figure 8 torpedo guard largely gone. Here, as you can see, that guard is intact and in place, and you get a better understanding of how this not only protected the torpedo caps, but also was used to try to cut net. This torpedo guard type, by the way, was only used in the earliest subs. After Pearl Harbor, all of these were removed from their subs and replaced with a different type with sort of a landing sled for the bottom. So this is a feature only used in the Pearl Harbor subs. You can also see as we come into it, just beneath those, the torpedo tubes, which are empty. These torpedoes were fired. And you can also see, moving aft, another hole punched into this by the Navy salvors, who raised this sub off of the bottom, strung cable through it, picked it up, and then dumped it here in deeper water. Terry, it looks pretty much the same, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's still looking pretty good. That hole that's in the side there on the starboard side is a little bigger. That was small, so that hole is growing. And the hole that they punched in to put the cable in seems like it's sagged a little too. But other than that, the torpedo guards, everything, it looks like it's still in pretty good shape.
It does. Hans, how's it look to you?
Just like the last time we were there, Jim. See if they zoom it. I'm impressed with the size of that hole punched in for the hawser. You know, I imagine that was after they rigged it, removed it out of the water, then used some kind of major equipment or driver, pile driver, to punch that hole in the hull.
Thank you, Hans. Same drill as before, guys. When you're done with your moves and you're happy, we'll just circumnavigate and we'll pause on both ends. The blunt end is of interest to us, but also the end with the torpedo tubes as well. We need some good images. Thank you. Burl, we'll take a look at that brace when we come around again to the bow. We'll probably get a couple of angles on it. They fired probably at the USS St. Louis. So as we're moving into position here, we're in the bow section, and for those of you who joined us on the USS Ward Midget dive, the flange that had separated on the Ward Midget and broken apart is the same flange that you see here, which means as we were looking inside through the separation of the hull, some of what we were looking at in that interior space were the ends of the two torpedo tubes. You can see the two torpedo tubes here. One is cracked, but these spherical ends have these valves on the end, or these I should say, Don't you just love it when you're pushing 60 and the word goes out of your head? Just the handles. You can see the main charging lines.
Welcome. I'm Frank.
Burl says the holes look punched, not cut. Jackhammer. Could be, or maybe if you had something on the end of a crane, like a big, I don't know.
Something dropping.
Sounds good, yeah. And I agree with Terry. They're getting larger over time, so they were smaller when they were punched.
Yeah, they're just maybe opening up more. Again, with the differential corrosion happening because of the impact and the cracking. Perfect. Yeah, you guys are reading our minds here. We want to really pause here. We just want to take a long, hard look at this, and we're going to zoom in on some features. You see the handle there, the lower, just around by your lasers. That's one end of the torpedo tube. The other one up above is cracked. And let's zoom in on those torpedo tubes.
Jim, torpedoes. Those tubes look a lot worse than the last time we saw them. They're really cracked and blasted apart now.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's a lot of change.
Okay, you guys, pilots, are at the first torpedo tube. Hold a second, Shore. You're at the first torpedo tube with the crack. Go beneath that, and you're going to see the second one with its round handle. And that's... Go ahead, Shore. What were you saying?
What is what looks like a white ladder sticking out of the dorsal top?
I'll have to take a look at that again. Stand by and we will.
It looks like a white ladder stands into it.
Yeah, we'll take a look, Tony. So we are at the firing end of the torpedo tube. These torpedoes could not be loaded inside like larger submarines. They would slip these torpedoes, these 18-foot long torpedoes, into the bow, lock them in place, and then proceed. And then these torpedoes would be fired from inside. It was one shot only for each. That was it. When these were done, then the submarine was out of ammo and had to return to the mothership.
Those tubes look a lot worse than the last time we saw them. They're really cracked and dropping apart now. Yeah, that's amazing. That's about it.
Okay, back out a little bit, please.
Hold a second, Short. You're at the first torpedo tube with the crack. Go beneath that, and you're going to see the second one.
Do you see the...
Go ahead, Short. What were you saying? What looks like a white ladder sticking out of the dorsal top?
So, right-hand side, see the smaller piping with the joint? Zoom in there, please.
Yeah, look at this. So we are at the firing end of the torpedo tube. The torpedoes could not be loaded inside like the larger submarine. They would slip these torpedoes, these 18-foot long torpedoes, into the bow. They would lock them in place. And then proceed. And then these torpedoes would be fired from inside. It was one shot only for each. That was it. When these were done, then the submarine was out of ammo and had to return to the mothership.
Burl, am I recalling that this is the location for firing? I mean, that there are handles here? I know that you could also fire from the control room.
He says unknown.
Okay, we can back off. So now you see the white covered piping at the top? Let's move in towards there. Okay, Tony, we're at what I think you were talking about.
Well, am I recalling that it's in the 12 o'clock position.
Okay.
Like
above? Do we need to go higher? Can you tilt up a bit, please?
They may be white painted pipes, but it looks like a ladder.
Where we're at right now, Tony? I don't think it's a ladder, Tony. It's piping that's been covered with marine growth. And there's control rods that are also in this area. So I think that that's what we're likely looking at here. Okay, guys, let's pull out. And after we hold here for another minute or so, then we can proceed around back towards the tip of the bow.
Yeah, it's pipes. Okay. It looked kind of like a ladder.
Pipes or rods? Okay, when you're ready, we can proceed.
Where we're at right now, Tony?
Jim, this is Hans. Those blocks, are those ballasted in the bow section?
Let's see. Hans, I thought we had seen some ballast blocks that had been lying on the bottom near here.
Yeah, I know they had small ballast blocks that they could shift inside manually when they had to.
Yeah, lead.
Those did look like lead.
Okay, when you're ready, we can proceed. This is on wood blocks. There's other ballots. I thought we had seen some ballot blocks that had been lying on the bottom of the acre.
See a fish there. Bruce, what are we looking at?
Yeah, you're actually seeing two fish here. There's a grayish fish with black spots and a black bar across the eye. That's one of these duck-billed fish with the flattened snout, kind of like a duck's bill. The reddish fish is a scorpion fish. It's in the same family as shallow water scorpion fish, the same family as the lionfish that were introduced into the Atlantic Ocean. They have venomous spines along the back. And again, they're sort of an ambush predator. They rest on the bottom and wait for small prey like little shrimps and things to come by and then lunge out to eat their prey. At these depths, there's less artificial light, or OV, that's really making things look very bright. But that red color in the dim light of the deep ocean, if it's visible at all, it looks black or dark brown. So the fish is much less visible in the natural light depth than it is now with the bright lights of the ROV. A lot of fish have eyes that are much more sensitive to light than human eyes, so they can see silhouettes, things like that, a little bit better than we can, even with the dim light, the very dim light at this depth.
This is Okeanos video engineer Roland Bryan making a general announcement to all those on the conference call. Please check your microphones on your phones. If you're not actively speaking at the time, please mute your telephones. We're getting some very bad echo coming back and being recorded on our permanent archive video. Please check your phones. If you're on any phone connected to the conference, please mute your mic unless you're actively speaking.
Yeah, thank you, Roland. Let's throw some lasers on that hole, too. Yeah. Hans and Terry, others, you notice that this hole is not too far away from the other hole we saw on the word midget.
Yeah, Jim, I was looking at that and wondering if that was also a spot where the supporting strap for the torpedo guard might have pulled out, but it looks a little further aft than that, and I think I can see the strap attached forward of this hole. So we're scratching our heads as to what might have initiated this hole, but once initiated, they keep growing.
Roger that. Copy. Thank you, guys. Yeah, it is. I'll get to it in a second. Yeah. Yeah, pilots, we're going to just go straight bow on and pause and just take a look here at the front of this figure 8. And also then we're going to zoom in on the torpedo tubes. So what you're seeing here as we come around the bow is there's a mount just behind the torpedo guard at the top of the hull, and that is the mount for the forward end of the wire that came off the conning tower used as a net cutter.
So would those have actually been sharpened there on the edges?
I don't think they were particularly sharpened. I think the idea was just that the wire was there and they'd cut it, and likewise this metal would also just largely protect it, and not knife-like sharp, no. There's no accounting of that in the records, and having looked at Sakamaki's sub, I don't recall it being particularly sharp. So as you can see, the torpedo tubes are empty. These torpedoes have been fired. And again, for those of you just joining us, this submarine did participate in the Pearl Harbor attack. We believe that it is the submarine launched, and others have noted this as well. It's not like we're the first to say this. It's launched by the submarine I-16. Unlike other theories, we believe this submarine did not penetrate Pearl Harbor, but rather was the submarine spotted by the USS Condor at 3:42 in the morning, sought after by the USS Ward and not seen after an hour's search, at which time we feel this sub most likely parked itself on the bottom or loitered around the entrance to Pearl Harbor in and around the port hand buoy, or buoy number 1, heading into the harbor. At that location, the USS St. Louis, leaving Battleship Row, claimed to have been fired on with 2 torpedoes missing it, and having seen it, what they described as a baby submarine, fired at it and it disappeared. They thought perhaps they'd hit it. Others have suggested that they were firing at a towed paravane used to sweep for mines. But interestingly enough, in 1951, the submarine was found, according to a letter in the Navy archives, by an oceanographic expedition, and under orders of the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, that submarine was quote-unquote to be destroyed. This location rests straight off that point by a few miles, and our suspicion is that this craft was raised. It had been sunk by a scuttling charge set off by its crew, who most likely were inside when that happened, though we can't say for sure. The craft raised was cut into a third and final piece, holes cut or punched into it, as you can see, looped with cable, placed on what was most likely a barge, and then taken out and dumped in deep water. Each of these 3 pieces is in close proximity to the other, which is why this is largely known today as the 3-piece Midget site, though others refer to it as I-16 tow or I-16's boat, using the Japanese term for these craft during the war. This submarine was identified as a Pearl Harbor attack craft by Admiral Kazuo Ueda of the Imperial Japanese Navy and a veteran of the Kohauteki Corps. This craft, in its component pieces, was discovered by the University of Hawaii's Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory, the team of Terry Kirby, Steve Price, Max Kramer, Colin Wallerman, Chris Kelly, and others, in the Pisces 4 and Pisces 5 submersibles. 1992, 2000, and 2001, the 3 pieces were found, and their research has driven much of what we are doing today, as well as in previous dives, and they are participating in these dives today from our shore-based exploration and command center at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. Nothing else at this angle we want to zoom in on. Shore, you're happy with this?
Yeah, we're feeling pretty good, Jim.
Copy. So, guys, if we can just navigate, if you can, around to the other side, the higher berm, with that, we will then call it a dive.
Cully here.
Go ahead.
Was there any sign of washboard damage on this one, on any of the three sections from depth charges?
No, we didn't see any washboard damage on this, nor did we see any washboard damage on the Ward Midget. The one sub that did have washboard damage, other than the Monahan Midget, is the one that was found in Kehi Lagoon. That one clearly had gone through a pretty serious pounding. When the Navy found it in 1960, the motor had been knocked off its mounts. There was broken piping, shattered lights, and some washboarding. But this one, no. So, for whatever reason, I think these guys escaped that. Washboard damage is caused by the overpressures in the water when the depth charge goes off. And so what it does is, what's called washboarding, is it indents the hull plating between the frames, so it looks like an old-fashioned washboard. That, what you're looking at now is the point where the wire would be shackled to for the forward wire, the forward line, the wire that would, the net cutting wire that would come off the forward part of the conning tower. Burl, are you happy with what we're seeing in terms of the placement of the hardware mounting the figure 8? It's all looking pretty straightforward to me. You know where they punch that through is by the access plate. Okay. Got it. Yeah. It's a fitting. Yeah. There she is. There's the access plate. Okay. So pilots, as we move along here, as we come to this end, do you see that those markings on the hull there that look somewhat ovoid, the oval? Right here at the very end, just barely out through the corrosion, that's an access plate. I'd like to just focus on that.
Looking for it, Jim.
You see it, Hans? There it is.
Not yet.
Here, directly in front of us. Pattern recognition, my friend. See it?
No.
No, no. I gotta confess, I know because I've crawled through these things when they're not all grody. But yeah, that's an access plate right there. Here. I'm also the guy that would spend a couple of years crawling through a Civil War thing that's all covered in rust and trying to figure out pipelines and charging lines and all of that. That's when you know that your archaeology is an obsession. So, okay. All right, I'm happy. The access panel is there and it's not sprung. Okay, guys, we're good. You see it now? Sure, see it now a little bit more? No.
We're still looking.
All right. Frank sees it. If Frank sees it, I'm happy. You know.
You can see it on the right edge of the screen. It just came more centered.
Yeah.
A little tilt down. And you're backing out.
All right.
Yeah, I think I see a unicorn.
All right. We've had enough fun.
It's now filling the left edge and the just went off left edge of the screen.
It's okay. I've seen it. Frank's seen it. Bob Schwemmer's seen it. Team here has seen it.
You're full wide.
And I think we're good. That's it, guys. We are good. Bravo, Zulu. Well done. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to end this dive. And we're going to recover the ROV. I want to end by thanking, again, so many that made this possible. Global Foundation for Ocean Exploration, NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, and the Maritime Heritage Program. Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument, NOAA's Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, the University of Hawaii and the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory, the Bofin Museum, the National Museum of the Pacific War, and so many individuals, too many to be named, many of whom have joined this dive both on the ship and through the magic of telepresence. I want to thank our broadcast partners who have shared this with so many around the world. It's been somewhat awe-inspiring and absolutely humbling for those of us to realize that many of you are watching this streamed live on ABC, on USA Today, the Weather Channel, and others, as well as CBS News. Thank you all very much. And to each and every one of you from the public who has watched, we are ever mindful of the fact that we do this work for you. We work for you as civil servants and as public servants, bringing you what we find beneath the oceans as well as in the atmosphere, sharing the science, sharing the discoveries, and particularly on this occasion of the 75th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, sharing this with you as we once again look at what rests below as part of this history. I also close finally by noting and acknowledging the sacrifices made on this day 75 years ago. Brave young men called into action, many of whom would never go home again. We see ships sitting on the bottom, both at Pearl Harbor with the Utah and the Arizona, and these two Midget submarines as a reminder, as well as aircraft which still rest beneath the waters. We're reminded when we see the graves of those at the Punch Bowl and at other national cemeteries, and we're reminded by those living veterans of the event, the last of whom who have been able to, who have joined us all here today in Hawaii. The sacrifices they made changed the world. The sacrifices they made, both the living and the dead, made this world a better place. And as one who grew up in the aftermath of this war, I am eternally grateful for the freedoms that I have enjoyed, thanks to the sacrifices of the greatest generation. From the ship Okeanos Explorer, live from Pearl Harbor, thank you all.